We have one more guest to come back, but I think he can make his way up. And we will begin the second half of the performance conversation with another story by Ruben Martinez.
Thank you. And I'm actually not reading a story of my authorship, but John Fante, Ask the Dust. How many people are familiar with John Fante, the author? Actually, can I see those hands again? Goodness. Foundational author of Los Angeles Fictions. Son of Italian immigrants. Grew up in Denver and came west to Los Angeles, 1920s. Was on Bunker Hill during the Great Depression, and wrote quite, in many ways, autobiographically. This is chapter 6 from Ask the Dust, and obviously I was referencing migrations. This was another kind of migration that his alter ego, Arturo Bandini, was at the heart of during the Great Depression on Bunker Hill. I went up to my room, up the dusty stairs of Bunker Hill, past the soot-covered frame buildings along that dark street, sand and oil and grease choking the futile palm trees standing like dying prisoners, chained to a little plot of ground of black pavement hiding their feet. Dust and old buildings and old people sitting at windows, old people tottering out of doors, old people moving painfully along the dark street. The old folk from Indiana and Iowa and Illinois, from Boston and Kansas City and Des Moines. They sold their homes and their stores, and they came here by train, by automobile, to the land of sunshine, to dine in the sun, a few dollars in the bank, enough to subscribe to the Los Angeles Times, enough to keep alive the illusion that this was paradise, and that their little papier-mâché homes were castles. The uprooted ones, the empty, sad folks, the old and the young folks, the folks from back home. They were my countrymen. These were the new Californians. With their bright polo shirts and sunglasses, they were in paradise. They belonged. But down on Main Street, down on Town and San Pedro, and for a mile on Lower Fifth were the tens of thousands of others. They couldn't afford sunglasses or a 4-bit polo shirt, and they hid in the alleys by day and slunk off to flop houses by night. A cop won't pick you up for vagrancy in Los Angeles if you wear a fancy polo shirt and a pair of sunglasses. But if there's dust on your shoes and that sweater you wear is thick like the sweaters they wear in the snow countries, he'll grab you. So get yourself a polo shirt, boys, and a pair of sunglasses, and white shoes if you can. Be collegiate. Lying in my bed, I thought about them, watched the blobs of red light from the St. Paul Hotel jump in and out of my room, and I was miserable. For tonight, I had acted like them. Smith and Parker and Jones. I had never been one of them. Ah, Camilla. When I was a kid back home in Colorado, it was Smith and Parker and Jones who hurt me with their hideous names, called me Wop and Dago and Greaser. And their children hurt me, just as I hurt you tonight, Camilla. I see them in the lobbies of hotels. I see them sunning in the parks and limping out of ugly little churches, their faces bleak from proximity with their strange gods, out of Amy's temple, out of the church of the great I Am. I have seen them stagger out of their movie palaces and blink their empty eyes in the face of reality once more, and stagger home to read the Los Angeles Times, to find out what's going on in the world. I have vomited at their newspapers, read their literature, observed their customs, eaten their food, desired their women, gaped at their art. But I'm poor. My name ends with a soft vowel, and they hate me and my father and my father's father, and they would have my blood and put me down, but they are old now, dying in the sun and in the hot dust of the road, and I am young and full of hope and love for my country and my times. And when I say greaser to you, Camilla, it is not my heart that speaks, but the quivering of an old wound. And I am ashamed of the terrible thing I've done. She comes into your dreams on Bunker Hill, typing up a story in the wee hours still. The road to Los Angeles was no breeze. Then that Mexican girl put you down on your knees. And your book's no good, Bandini, no matter how you try. Write a letter to the editor, Bandini, with a sigh. Camellia was pouring your coffee on a Santa Ana night. You laughed at her wide arches, but that was just your own fright. An Italian boy, you're just a brick, hey, your son. Desperate not to do your old man's job. And California's trembling beneath your feet. On Bunker Hill, you only got oranges to eat. Now the boom's gone to bust, baby, just ask the dust. Yeah, the boom's gone to bust, baby, just ask the dust. You took her hand on Angel's flight today. You picked a fight just to push her back away. She's a stranger to you and you're a stranger to yourself. And she knows you better than anyone else. So look in the mirror of her watery coffee skin. Inside her story, your love is so well hidden. Now the boom's gone to bust, baby, just ask the dust. Yeah, the boom's gone to bust, baby, just ask the dust. You wanna give Camellia words to speak, but she's learned her own dialogue on the street. When you turn away from her, there's no one left to trust. And the boom's gone to bust. Yeah, your love's gone to rust. So baby, ask the dust. Well, in your book, you're gonna head out into the desert. And down those dusty roads, you'll be chasing after her. You shot across the country to wind up in a big empty. You and Camellia lost beyond the ruins of the city. And you ride in your room, Bandini, all alone, staring through a sooty world, a world that's falling down.
Now I need to introduce 3 more people. Quick introductions. I'm not going to do them justice. I never do an introduction, so please read their bios in the brochure. They are fabulous, beginning with Linnell George, who is an award-winning journalist. She has been a reporter for the LA Times. Her work is featured in KCET's Outbound and Departures. She is the author of The Crystal Stare, I think, is that right?
No Crystal Stare.
Yes, The Crystal Stare, African Americans in Los Angeles. She also has received a fellowship from the USC Huntington Fellowship. Did I say that right? That's not quite right either, did I?
That's all right.
Yeah, say it right.
It's the Annenberg.
Annenberg. I knew there was a word I was missing there. Please welcome, because I botched up her introduction, Linnell George. This gentleman I truly owe a debt of thanks to, Oscar Garza here. He is senior editor at KPCC's Daily Art and Entertainment program. The reason we owe him a debt of thanks is because that should have read Kristen Moeller on the name tag, but she had to respond to a family emergency. And he, at the last minute, agreed without any arm twisting whatsoever, I think, to take her place. Yeah. He has held several senior editor positions, one at the Los Angeles Times, including what I read daily, the calendar section, the Sunday magazine, as well as the arts section, and I'm very pleased to have him with us as well. And last but not least is your moderator for the day, Allison Carruth. She is professor of English at UCLA and also in the Society for Institute in Genetics, and as well the Institute for Environmental and Sustainability. This is not right, I'm adding the word issues, but that's what they deal with, environment and sustainability issues. And in that capacity, she is also director of LENS, which is the environmental narrative strategies. That's close. And what that does is looks at how we receive environmental information, how we perceive it, and moreover, what we do with it. She is also the author of Literature and Food Studies, and that's not right, Global Appetites, American Power, and the Literature of Food. And I give them all my apologies because I really begged her to do these introductions, and she said, no, you can do it. And clearly I can't. So now it's up to you to make up for my deficit. Okay, thank you.
So we have a little less than half an hour to be in conversation. I'm really delighted to be here. And so we're going to start with Linnell actually offering a kind of follow-on story to those we've already heard from some of the other panelists.
Hello, everybody. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Okay, all right. Good afternoon. I'm going to start by, when I spoke to Claudia months ago, we've been having this ongoing conversation about stories and place and hidden narratives. And when I first started talking to you, I had been working on these essays, but now these essays have become a book. And so I'm going to be reading a little bit from one of the chapters I'm working on that deals with some of the topics we are talking about today, and that is story and place and hidden narratives. And so you get a preview of what I'm working on. So this first section is called Raising Ghosts. I loathe losing my way in my hometown. Even more, I resent the hectoring GPS that overcorrects my turns, that edits my circumvention. I silence it with a I know better finality, because generally I do. But truth be told, I'm stumped. I'm idling in front of a row of blank-eyed storefronts, emptied of I am not sure what. The address I've scrawled on a scrap of paper doesn't square. I eye a newish, low-slung, coolly lit restaurant where an old high school friend and I dined and reminisced recently. Though we'd traveled up and down this boulevard weekly, we couldn't recall its former incarnation, shoe store or This troubles me, mostly because I should. I've taken it as my task to remember the progression and story of neighborhoods I pass through regularly. I stash my car, and now on foot, arms crossed, I stare back at the glass storefronts, full of used to be and soon to be, and try to solve the riddle of the address. I could be anywhere. So I'm going to jump to this. This section is, I'm just going to read part of this from a section called Frills. My friend Victoria and I make a plan to visit her old apartment building, a beautiful perch overlooking Echo Park Lake. We were to meet up with her former manager, IA. I'd been looking to speak to someone who was knee-deep in all of this, someone who was monitoring the changes in neighborhoods, the revolving door of populace, but from a different point of view. The city's annual Lotus Festival is about to kick off early the next day, so the park and lake look exceedingly seductive in the deep amber afternoon light. I note among the healthy, luminous lotus blossoms and honking ducks more than a few new additions, children casting fishing lines at the east side of the lake with the help of mounting hat-crowned LAPD. Some newish sculpted shrubbery spelling out the words Echo Park. Frills, one gentleman, a longtime resident, pointed out. Almost too many frills. Beyond wariness, I wasn't sure what feeling was welling up inside me. On our walk over, I had made note of some of the businesses that were now occupying my memory of old storefronts. In their place stand new, themey, high-concept pubs, restaurants with taglines, a Brooklyn vibe on the east side. The neighborhood is in that phase of past and future crossing, the present harder to discern. I recognize enough boarded up and shuttered businesses with signage still in place to know where I am, but the present is looking like much of LA, austere cafes and high-end restaurants with one-word names or a cluster of words or elements distributed within a crossed X logo, and lots of sleek lines, glass and steel. What's so puzzling, no, infuriating about the details, the frills, is the impulse to erase, transform place. The neighborhoods my friends and I chose when we often selected so that we would experience a little bit of that flavor. The point of view, at least what was allowable, what we could earn in time and in fellowship. We looked for a place we felt in sync with, or, if we were lucky, would ultimately sync up with. We tried to adapt to neighborhoods, not alter them, to fit our goals or needs, not force them into our vision, or some of the moment trend. If there were problems, and there were, we tried to work together to resolve them. I shopped and ate locally. In the spring, I watched young men with dark, glossy hair punching at the air and take their laps around the lake, training for fights. In the summer, on a whim, we walked to Dodger Stadium to see what seats we could score last minute. I wanted to be like those tumbleweeds that used to skitter down my old hill, to pick up a piece of this and that and add it to my journey.
So I think I'll start with a question for Oscar and Linnell, and maybe Ruben, you might also want to chime in on this question about the relationship that you see as seasoned, award-winning journalists between the narrating of the day, of the day's news, of a kind of very particular 24-hour present, as compared to these multi-generational, multi-dimensional histories and stories that I think you also are engaged in narrating, both in the media outlets you work with and also beyond them. So I was sort of curious how you see the relationship between the news as one kind of storytelling and these deeper, longer histories of place, particularly when maybe the same stories come to a very particular place in Los Angeles, a particular street or neighborhood.
That's interesting because I'm a news and information junkie. I've always have been, and it's really gotten to be a little bit too much. I really feel like I've reached my limit, and I reach it on a daily basis. My wife and I have different schedules, and so like she's starting her information crash when I'm trying to end mine, and so there's a little. But I think the big difference I think is that audiences have so many choices now, and they don't necessarily have to rely on traditional media and ways of getting their information. Now, there's still a big gap and a big line there about how dependable and how truthful and how accurate some sources of media are, and that's where it's it sort of puts the onus on the audience, right, to figure that out for themselves. Where back in the day, it's like, well, you could pretty much trust what Walter Cronkite was saying, right? But you're not necessarily going to trust everything that you're hearing today. There's one thing that strikes me about the way we live today. There was a TV series in the late 50s, early 60s called Naked City. Some of you may remember it. I've watched a few episodes online. And it was the sort of dramas that were told in a quasi-documentary style. And at the end of every episode, the narrator would intone, there are 8 million stories in the Naked City, and this has been one of them. Well, pretty much those 8 million stories are being told every day now. And that's thanks to the democratization of media, which is something that our other panelists spoke about earlier, the other speakers. And that's a fabulous thing. When I say the democratization of media, I mean the internet recently, really, and what that's made possible. And it's you don't have to wait for somebody to tell your story. You can tell your story however way you want it. You can start a blog online, you can start a podcast. But all those things sort of now compete with news organizations and news institutions like mine. And so that's kind of the reality of what we're facing now and what I think about every day.
Two things that really just popped up. I started in the alternative press with Ruben working at LA Weekly, and I did a range of things when I was there. And one of the things that was, and it trained me for my job working at the LA Times as a features writer, which is I was not necessarily doing daily news. I was writing features off the news. So I had always been looking at how a story changes in the news cycle and to figure out, okay, it's national, what makes it more local, and what are my readers going to want, and what are my neighbors talking about, and what am I hearing? So in ways to try to repackage that national story. And again, you have to watch how it's going through the cycle, because it's changing every day. And as Oscar says, now it's changing every minute, because you want to make the story feel relevant, and it's got legs, and that people are going to be talking about it, and it's going to be in some way useful and catch eyes and clicks and all of that. Their other element too is this idea of hyperlocal, and these in all of these outlets now, like working with KCET or KPCC, where journalists are now like boring into neighborhoods that ordinarily we wouldn't have done before. We wouldn't have time to do before. When I was working for the Times, and they got rid of a lot of the regional sections, a lot of stories were getting lost and were getting erased. So you didn't really see the city in the same way. And now we have so much. And as Oscar says, I follow people who have blogs about Northeast LA or Los Feliz or Echo Park. But then sometimes it's down to a street. So yes, there is a lot now, but this is a way people can tell their own story and shape their own narrative.
So just to follow up, and I think maybe this can bring in the other panelists, what really struck me about everything we've heard today is, on the one hand, Ruben, you took us to one place in LA and told this sort of deep social story that goes back to the Tongva people, and you sort of layered all of these different communities, all of these different moments of struggle, of resistance, of settlement, both colonial and immigrant settlement. And it's one place, this kind of center. It's a street, it's a site. And then you gave us this deep history. And then, Henry, in your remarks, what I noticed is you sort of telling this story of global civic participation that is being sort of reimagined and reshaped in the age of the internet, in which there's a generational identity forming about civic action and participation that crosses space globally, and yet also carries these deep histories of resistance, of democracy, and so on. So I think my follow-up question is sort of what do some of you see as the role of the hyperlocal narrative, whether it's based on the event of the moment or the deep histories of that site, as compared to these kind of cross-space, stories and imagined communities? What are sort of their relative strengths and weaknesses, values to us as communities?
Well, maybe I'll start by thinking about the community I live in LA. You're hearing taught discussion of communities. I live in downtown LA. I live on Broadway and 9th at the Eastern Columbia building. So for me, that building represents the Wizard of Oz. I come home to the Emerald City every day because it's of the moment of the Art Deco movement that led to the Wizard of Oz looking the way it did. But lately, I realize I live in the Blade Runner street, right? So there's the Bradbury building is the center of the Blade Runner universe. It's probably Central Market across the way where the animals are being sold. We know that the $1 Million Theater is there. We know that the tunnel that's in the film is all there. I was shocked, having moved here, that Blade Runner takes place, the original Blade Runner takes place almost entirely in that end of Broadway. So when I look at Blade Runner, am I looking at a movie that's consumed around the world that has this narrative of the future, or do I see the history of that corner of LA, which we could break down just like the Olivera Street stories and really dissect what those buildings meant, the $1 Million Cinema's role as a Latino film center for a period of time in history. Why is the multicultural future of Blade Runner the way it is? And so encoded in these narratives are often a larger sense of history, but the narratives themselves can travel. So when we think about the Superman narrative coming out of a Jewish immigrant, and these young Latino activists discovered it 70 years later and had no idea what its origins were, but it spoke to them in a really powerful way about the question of being an immigrant coming from somewhere else and the American dream and what it is to fight for it. I think that's a powerful connection that people feel. So stories, even when they're uprooted, even when they travel, carry with them the memory traces. This is what George Lipsitz, who's a big inspiration of mine, would have talked about, the memory traces of where they came from. So we want stories with robust histories. Would Hunger Games be as powerful if the district wasn't really rooted in Appalachian culture, and if Jennifer Lawrence wasn't from Kentucky and therefore representing the kind of mining community culture that she's coming out of when she represents her district in District 9. So I think pop culture is full of history and full of local, even as it travels. But the ability to travel, you need something local to be universal. You need something specific to be something that people can grab hold and feel tangible and make the future feel alive to people. So I don't see a contradiction between those things at all.
Yeah, exactly. Just riffing on that just a little bit more. Context, the idea of context. Susan Sontag's famous regarding the suffering of others was about photography, building on her earlier work in photography. And essentially, I think that her argument could be boiled down to that the image is so easily manipulated, fake news, right? That the photograph is not enough on its own, that it needs a text along with it, a context, right? And as storytellers, we're in space and time, and a story always has a backstory, which is the context, and a story has a place, so it's space and time. And that, to me, those things taken together, time and space in story, creating place, is just settling into a community. Is settling into relationship, and building a geography. You know, there's the famous Borges story about the map that's 1-to-1 ratio, right? You know, what would a map that's a 1-to-1 ratio look like? We're living in it. Right? So that kind of cartography that is always expanding needs to look back, but not to be chained to nostalgia, right? And not to be tyrannized by the present, the news cycle, to be able to imagine, right, creatively.
So, Michael, let me bring you into this conversation. I mean, today you gave us a really provocative sort of social and cultural history of fiction, of the changing concept and sort of uses and abuses of fiction, and how that might shed light for us on this framework of fake news that's being deployed by entities and individuals who mean that term in profoundly different ways. But a lot of your work has been about providing similar kind of histories about science fiction in particular, and speculative narrative. And so with this point that Ruben just brought up, nostalgia, I wanted to kind of ask you about how you as a cultural historian of narrative, think about the roles of science fiction in connecting past to future. And how often do you actually see in science fiction quite a lot of nostalgia for a return to some kind of past, but set in some distant time or place?
Right. Well, there's a lot of nostalgia in science fiction, and one of the greatest, the most popular genres right now is dystopia. And anything that is dystopian is, in effect, a form of nostalgia for a previous period that may not have been that great, but is not as bad as we have it now. So there's certainly that aspect of it. But there's another aspect of nostalgia in terms of science fiction that is interesting, and that is that science fiction writers today are actually looking back at an earlier period when people were more optimistic about the future. And there was a sense that the future would be better. There would be progress. Usually these stories were written from the 1920s to about 1945, and then things took a different turn. And a number of the writers today now want to go back because they feel that we do need these narratives rooted in the present that will take us into a viable, sustainable future that is optimistic and that we can get behind. So we're seeing some science fiction writers actually trying to kind of create a new, a revision of that attitude that's a little more dark. It doesn't have that kind of gung-ho optimism that some of the science fiction writers had, but nevertheless still charts a positive direction for us. So there's that aspect also of nostalgia. There's a third aspect too, and that is that there are science fiction fans who are very opposed to the direction science fiction has taken in terms of diversity, in terms of narratives that are critical of our current government and other aspects of reality, and very much want to go back to a kind of more simplistic, entertaining set of stories about giant guns in space, in effect. And it's been an interesting rearguard action, actually. They attempted to take over the Hugo Awards, which are the majority awards in the field, simply by buying memberships and then nominating their stories, in effect. There was luckily a backlash against this, and so they didn't succeed. But I think that it's interesting when we think about science fiction, we often think that it is about the future. It's not about the past, but it's incredibly about the past, and not just the past, actually. It's actually as much about the present as it is about the future. In fact, all science fiction is really about the present. It's about the questions that we have, the concerns that we have. We set these in the future, but nevertheless, we are talking about the issues that face us now. So I think that aspect of nostalgia is an important one to recall.
Please, Oscar.
I wanted to pick up on that, but to talk about storytelling as a form of nostalgia, because I think there's a lot of that going on. So, before television, radio was this great medium where storytelling happened, right? People listened to stories over the radio. And so now fast forward to today, and it's been recreated thanks to, or you can blame National Public Radio for it, how many of you listen to This American Life or have ever listened to This American Life? So that sort of started the craze of the new era of storytelling on radio, and it has begat, several other programs and hundreds, maybe thousands of podcasts, right? So there's, Snap Judgment, there's The Moth, it goes on and on. And it's incredible that, again, to go back to this notion of you don't have to depend on somebody else to tell your story, that's available for you to do yourself. But there is, I think, in an odd way, I think there is a nostalgia about that, right? Because before, we told stories in our families, and we hoped that those stories would be passed down to generation. But now people are, putting those stories out globally. Maybe a little bit too much. I don't know. People ask me, what podcast do you listen to? And I'm like, I listen to people talk all day. And so the last thing I'm going to do is go home and listen to more people talk. But yeah, I think there's something about storytelling being kind of a nostalgic thing, and I don't think the 20-somethings or 30-somethings even who are doing a lot of that now, the storytelling, are sort of quite aware of that kind of tradition that they are part of.
So this connects to your framework of participatory culture. Do you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to jump on the
jump in,
nostalgia
yeah.
a little bit, and I'll pull it toward participatory culture. So there's really, Svetlana Boym has written a book called The Future of Nostalgia, which really talks about two different kinds of nostalgia. So there's a conservative nostalgia, which is about a return to a homeland, a desire to turn back the clock to create a different society, and we can think of Make America Great Again as a kind of nostalgia in that spirit. And then there's another nostalgia, which is using the past to critique the present and using the present to critique the past, that's engaged in a more complex set of relationships between past and present. And I would say Hamilton would be a good example of a text which is celebrating founding fathers, but also laying claim for people who were never part of those narratives before, and reimagining the origins of America as a more inclusive and diverse society. So as we think about the nostalgia of science fiction fans and fan politics, it turns out complex, even if you want to be conservative nostalgia. So you've heard the story of white protest against black stormtroopers around Star Wars, right? And that's, on the surface, is a simple black-white racist story until you find out that the complaint was the stormtroopers were clones. We know the origin of the clones. They're the clones of John Gaffett, who was a Pacific Islander. So they were never fighting for a white stormtrooper. They were fighting for continuity around already a multicultural version of the Star Wars universe. And even if they had been, they were fighting for the right to be a Nazi, because Lucas had envisioned the stormtroopers as standing in for the Nazis and World War II propaganda films. So simple struggles over the past in science fiction. Because science fiction is so allegorical, because there's so many layers to these stories, because so many histories are interconnected, that struggles over the past and future in science fiction often are much more politically complex than I think we assume when you look at them on the surface. And that's because as a society we're struggling with inclusion and diversity issues. So for every fan who's upset by a black stormtrooper, there are fans who are fan casting science fiction and fantasy films, saying, here are the actors of color we'd like to see playing these parts. There are fans writing stories about the mixed race Hermione, and why it's important for them to have inclusion of other people's narratives into their fantasy and science fiction. So the participatory culture I see is struggling as much as Hollywood is to how to open the door for diverse narratives in a space that has historically been white. And that is, to my mind, critical nostalgia, not simply complacent nostalgia or conservative nostalgia in the sense that we're talking about.
So we're about out of time with our conversation, but I actually want to raise a question for you, Linnell, with your phrase of hidden narratives, which is really important to your work and I think to the work of a lot of those of us up here. Oscar, this is not just kind of an Oscar comment, but it's something I've been thinking about, and Claudia and I talked about. There are so many stories being produced and generated across so many media by individuals and collective bodies and so on right now. And so from your point of view, can there be so many that maybe the most salient or provocative hidden narratives get drowned out, let's say, if that makes sense as a question? Or what are the kind of strategies for you as a storyteller and journalist of breaking through that quantity of storytelling so that a coherent narrative you're trying to tell might break through?
I think what I look for when I'm talking to people and as I listen and move in through the world, I look for resonances. So whenever I start to hear like pings or like repeated narratives, or even if it's coming in from all these different places or age groups, or it's crossing over, you know, I know that like this is a story that should be told, and there's enough here that there's a way to tell it bigger, and so that you don't have all of this crosstalk going on in separate places, that it becomes this collected piece. I was thinking about this also this week because I was interviewing a young community organizer, and he was talking about the challenge of his work, you know, because what is community now, especially when you have issues like gentrification and homelessness, and, you know, how do you bring people together, because community organizing is really is organizing around a story. And so he was talking about the challenge of that, you know, how do you create narratives? And a lot of it is for him too, is like really listening to like, how can we bring more people together and to tell their story, and then realize that we all have a stake in that story.
Thank you. So before we close with a final performance from Ruben, I just wanted to give a very brief kind of 1-minute remark about a story that was coming together for me in this room, and it was inspired by this quote from Sarah Bixby, yes? Bixby Smith. So, the growing habits of the place persist. It is alive. Each time I go back, I find some new thing. And I was looking around the room, and there are all of these really gorgeous illustrations of plants. And these plants are really kind of charged for LA, the Southern California region, in terms of how we think about plants and aesthetics and ornamentation, from Japanese bamboo to several species of roses, bougainvillea, queen palm tree. These are all introduced species, what some biologists would call invasives, although that term carries with it all sorts of narratives about who does and doesn't belong, both human and non-human.
They're undocumented species.
Yeah, undocumented, they are undocumented species. But each of these carry with them communities, both settler colonial communities, immigrant communities, native communities. And so I want to return us full circle to Claudia's opening story, itself a set of layered stories about this place. And these plants, I think, hidden behind them, the hidden narratives behind them, are the various communities who brought these plants, human communities, for whom these plants, you know, are full of stories. So, you know, even though right now, and I'm part of this in my own garden, there's a rage of native plant gardening in California, and it's ecologically important, we should never suppress entirely the plants and the stories that aren't native. But so I thought with that I would turn it over to Ruben for, I think, a closing performance.
And I was at the what's the association? The Association of Literature and for the Environment. ASLI. And I used the term invasive species, and somebody immediately, a hand shot up immediately. And said, we call them wanderers. Plants have agency. So one final story from the same place that I've been trying to conjure for you, downtown, heart of downtown Los Angeles, and a ghost, one final ghost. The ghost's name is Ricardo Flores Magón, Mexican, anarchist, exile, 3 strikes. Fleeing the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, he winds up in turn-of-the-century Los Angeles, the reddest city in America. Socialists, communists, anarchists smoke, drink, argue ideology at the Italian Hall on Olvera Street. These are the anti-boosters calling for world revolution against the robber barons like Harrison Gray Otis at the Los Angeles Times. Radical commune versus radical capital. Ricardo and his brother Enrique set up shop blocks off the plaza, publishing a radical newspaper called Regeneración, regeneration. They live in a commune in Silver Lake. Can you imagine an anarchist commune in Silver Lake today? I think the anarchists have been priced out of the neighborhood. They live in a commune in Silver Lake, just north of the reservoir. Ricardo writes a play there. Everyone in the commune gets a part. The dream lasts until the LAPD raids it sending Ricardo to the county jail. Back then, it was on Broadway and Temple, 1 block from where Occupy LA would create Solidarity Park a century later. There's a window on the 3rd floor from where Ricardo can look down at the street and look for his partner Maria and stepdaughter Lucia. She's barely a teenager, but already leading the marches for his release downtown. Maria and Lucia walk by in the afternoons and look up. They wave, and if the guards have left the window open, they call out to each other. Maria and Ricardo keep up a fervent correspondence, letters of love and revolution. Maria de mi vida, Maria of my life. Solo tengo fe en las dos cosas que yo amo, tú y la revolución. I have faith only in the 2 things that I love, you and the revolution. Sí, María, fuera de ti y de la revolución nada hay para mí ni nada quiero. Yes, Maria, beyond you and the revolution there is nothing for me, nor do I want anything. Solo en ti y en la revolución pienso. De las dos estoy enamorado. I think only of you and the revolution. I am in love with you both. Over the last 100 years, this story has been erased by generations of boosters and real estate listings. Writing you from inside, where they never turn off the lights. I'm writing you from inside, where I resist with all my might. I must tell you a painful truth, my body doesn't match my mind. It's broken, just a token of the youth I left outside. Haunted streets of Juarez, prison of Belém, Plaza of Los Angeles, the state my body's in. For a time we lived our dream in a peaceful patch of land. We ate just what we sowed, with art we took a stand. The air in here stings my lungs, my legs they swell with pain. Their power does these things to you, like a desert robin rain. Haunted streets of Juarez, prison of Belém, Plaza of Los Angeles, state my body's in. Solo en ti, revolución, pienso. De las dos estoy enamorado. Nada hay para mí ni nada quiero. De las dos estoy enamorado. Tell the sisters and the brothers not to fall into the trap. Changing one state for another will throw us off the path. The news spills across the border, disorder everywhere in sight. They've torn our body asunder. Somehow we must unite. Haunted streets of what is prison of Belen, Plaza Los Angeles, state my body's in. Haunted streets of what is prison of Belen, Plaza Los Angeles, state my body's in. Thank you.
We've heard poignancy, we've heard passion, we've heard a little bit of fiction up there, and lots of fantasy, and moreover, very intelligent, good thought. Won't you thank all our featured guests today? I heard a talk on TEDx not long ago. No, it was a TED Talk by an author from Nigeria, and she spoke about the danger of a single story. And you've heard that comment up here many times. Do we have too many? But I also think the danger of a single form. Stories come from all different mediums, and all these plants come from our gardens at Rancho Los Alamitos, and every one of them reveals a cultural story, an ecological story, a story of immigrants, native and newcomers, and water in Los Angeles and where we live. So everywhere we look here, we consider it a story, including you all. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope that we see you in 2 weeks.